people are yelling for ceasefire, even though Hamas doesn't accept Israel, even though Hamas attacked during a ceasefire, even though Hamas won't accept the ceasefire. They're calling on a ceasefire, which just means Israel should cease firing. Anyone who wants a ceasefire before Hamas is destroyed is pro-Hamas.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, JNS.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. Thanks for joining us. We're continuing our JNS coverage of the war on Israel that was launched by Hamas on October 7th and the surge in anti-Semitism in the United States by speaking with columnist and author David Harsanyi. But first, I want to remind you to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. I also want to remind you that you don't have to wait a full week for more Top Story analysis. There is a daily Top Story podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the daily show under Top Story with Jonathan Tobin on the JNS channel on Apple, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can find the latest news, including Top Story, and other JNS TV content by going to jns.org or Telegram and subscribing. And now to today's program. With each passing week since the October 7th massacres, the Biden administration continues to double down on two contradictory policies that are only hurting Israel, as well as making the president's political problems even more acute. On the one hand, Biden is sticking to his original resolve to support Israel's right to self-defense and to eliminate Hamas, as well as vetoing UN Security Council resolutions that would force an immediate ceasefire, thus giving the terrorist group not only a reprieve but a victory in the war it started. That's infuriating his left-wing intersectional base, as well as Arab American and Muslim voters in crucial Michigan. To appease them, he has embarked on a series of steps pressuring Israel. From the start of the war, the administration has been second-guessing, micromanaging, and hamstringing the Israeli war effort, though without taking the one crucial step that would have effectively ended the war, cutting off the flow of arms and ammunition to resupply the Israel Defense Forces. Still, by doing everything but that to prevent Israel from finishing off Hamas in its last Gaza enclaves, the president is effectively stating that he wants the terrorists to survive. In recent weeks, he has enacted sanctions on Israelis living in Judea and Samaria, a gratuitous step that served as a prelude for a reversal of President Donald Trump's correct ruling that the U.S. didn't consider Jewish communities and the territories illegal. It's all part of a campaign to prepare the way for a renewed effort to create a Palestinian state after the war ends, even though the Palestinians have consistently rejected such a state if it means they have to live in peace with Israel. That's a reminder that for all of Biden's laudable post-October 7th posturing, which is then partly set off by his posturing against Israel, the foreign policy of this administration is nothing more than a reboot of the worst of the Obama-era ideas, including appeasing Iran, pressuring Israel, and an endless dive into the rabbit hole of trying to pretend that pleasing the Palestinians is the key to making the Middle East a safer place, when that is obviously not true. But it does raise some troubling questions about the future of American foreign policy under Biden, whether that means just another 10 months, 5 years, or something in between. It's worth asking why a man who claims that he entered the 2020 presidential race in order to register his revulsion about the anti-Semitism on display in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017, is now seeking to hold on to the office by appeasing anti-Semites in Michigan as well as Gaza and Ramallah. To discuss this, as well as the 2024 presidential race, and much else, we're pleased to have with us today one of the most acute and astute observers of American politics. David Harsanyi is a senior editor at the Federalist, a nationally syndicated columnist at National Review, and author of 5 books. Nanny State, how food fascists, teetotaling do-gooders, priggish moralists, and other boneheaded bureaucrats are turning America into a nation of children. First Freedom, a ride through America's enduring history with a gun. The people have spoken, and they are wrong, the case against democracy. Obama's Four Horsemen, the disasters unleashed by Obama's re-election. And the most recent, Eurotrash, why America must reject the failed ideas of a dying continent. David Harsanyi, welcome to Top Story.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Well, David, thanks so much for coming on and joining us. It's always a pleasure. I want to start by focusing on a recent interesting piece that you wrote, contrasting American policy towards the Ukraine war and Israel's war against Hamas, and why they're so different. So I guess the question to ask is, why is anything Ukraine does fine with the Biden administration, but the Biden administration feels it needs to micromanage everything that Israel does?
That's a complicated question. I think if we start at the beginning, I just believe that Biden himself, who, I don't think he has any sort of consistent foreign policy ideology or anything like that. I think it's just whatever he happens to, his gut tells him is right. I think he's surrounded by a lot of people who are antagonistic towards Israel, who want to lift Iran to a place where they become a regional power so they can buffer, again, be a buffer against Israeli and Sunni power there. And so his disposition is already sort of skeptical of Israel to begin with, at least the people around him. And so whatever Israel's always held to, even aside from that, Israel's always held to a different set of standards, I believe. So when it fights its wars, it is always, held back from finishing the job. I mean, you can go back to 1973 and remember how Kissinger sort of wanted the Egyptians to save face and walk away from that war. I think they're constantly doing this in an effort to make peace. And frankly, it worked in that case. I don't think with Hamas that's going to work at all, and it's unnecessary. So the difference is, I guess, that I'm not sure why the Ukrainian war, that we're not even allowed to talk about sort of a negotiated peace settlement to that conflict. And yet Israel is pushed to do that here with Hamas, I guess. So I don't know. I don't really know what their thinking is my answer, but I think it comes from a deep skepticism about Israel, about Netanyahu, about the Palestinian situation that you don't see in Ukraine, which has in some sense, very similar kind of problems on its eastern border. A lot of Russian nationals, ethnic Russians in these places. So they're very different situations in some ways. In some ways they're similar, but they're treated by the Americans very differently.
Yeah, I think that's true. But of course, we'll get into more about U.S. policy towards Israel. But with respect to Ukraine, Biden has tied aid to Israel in the upcoming foreign aid package, which has been endlessly debated by Congress. And, we're speaking the week Congress is coming back and, the House is going to have to deal with it one way or the other. And he's linked a much larger allocation of aid to Ukraine to a smaller allocation, although still hefty, aid to Israel, along with humanitarian aid towards Gaza, which who knows who that's going to. The question is, how legitimate is it to link these two causes, which are, as you said, very different wars, very different issues, and very different U.S. attitudes towards the war, because the official policy of, I think, Biden administration, many people, sort of within the D.C. Uniparty, as we who write for the Federalist like to call it, is, as Mitch McConnell says, the war in Ukraine is the most important thing in the world, and Ukraine must win, although they never tell us exactly what that looks like, even if certainly Russia is the bad guy in that conflict. So how do you feel about the way that the two causes have been linked in terms of foreign aid?
Well, Biden said that he would veto any standalone Israel aid bill, right? He would never veto a standalone Ukrainian aid bill. So I think that's a perfect illustration of what we're talking about right there. To perpetuate a war against a proxy war, frankly, against a nuclear power, and he would probably never he would probably veto a standalone border bill too, right? So
Yeah, well, we know he would. Yes.
exactly. So that tells us what? I mean, that tells us that the most important component of that debate, that bill and the negotiation there was the Ukrainian aid. The other day, even Germany voted against sending certain kinds of weaponry to Ukraine because they didn't want to, I guess, enmesh themselves in a way that they could never extricate, right? And when it comes to Russia itself and the war there. So like you said, I don't know what victory is supposed to look like. Whereas when it comes to Israel, I know exactly what victory is supposed to look like against Hamas, at least. I know that, you want to hold the people who not just, participated in the biggest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, probably, but that have been launching missiles at them constantly, and they want to hold those people responsible. That's clear to me. I'm not sure what the end game in Russia is. I want Ukraine to win. I just don't really know what that's supposed to look like. And as I wrote, yet, without, no one is even allowed to question our considerable aid to Ukraine without any kind of real established goals to what this is supposed to look like at the end. But yet Israel, which offers all of that, which is on the high moral ground here for sure, in my view at least, are constantly being pressured to to negotiate, to give up advantages, to create an enemy state right next door, to fund people who want to destroy them constantly. There's no other country that is asked to do those things.
Yes. I guess, but, and again, just to linger a moment on Ukraine, I keep wondering how it is that Ukraine did become the most important, the territorial integrity of Ukraine as it existed in 2014, because it seems right now the war isn't so much about Ukrainian independence as it is about Ukraine's goals of getting back Crimea and the parts of the eastern part of that country, that both of which Russia seized in 2014 without the United States lifting a finger. And I guess as bad as the Russians are, and they are the bad guys on this, I mean, the war is brutal, it was illegal. It's worth pondering how Ukraine became really a sacred cause when even post-October 7th, for much of the chattering classes, Israel is not.
Part of it, I think, is, and this is maybe a little cynical on my part, is a bit of, how Russia is tied to Donald Trump and Russians. So for them now, Russia is the worst thing that in existence. You'll remember that Biden was in charge of the reset during the Obama administration. It was a very different kind of disposition towards Russia. They were laughing at Mitt Romney for calling them a, I forgot how he kept
the greatest geostrategic threat. And Obama in the foreign policy debates of the 80s are calling, and they'll want their foreign policy back.
Exactly.
And everybody thought that was very witty and great.
Yeah. And all of a sudden they became, they stole an election, they undermined democracy, they attacked democracy. I find myself in a difficult spot with this because I don't really understand all the antagonism on the sort of populist right towards Ukraine. They're defending their borders as they see it. They have every right to do that. However, I also, on the other side, I hate to hear how this is a bulwark of democracy when we're talking about a nation that's not very democratic at all. I mean, it is a corrupt place. It is not particularly free for it, and the same people who like to portray Netanyahu as some kind of, authoritarian are constantly defending Zelensky, who shuts down churches, who's done all this anti-free speech stuff and so on. Now, even if I can rationalize what he's doing in the middle of a war, Israel is constantly in the middle of a war in some sense, and they don't do those sorts of things. And yet they're constantly thrown in with Hungary and all these other countries, as some kind of authoritarians by certain people, on the right. I don't even know what you asked me, but so the point is that that the debate is kind of skewed in such a weird way, where we're supposedly the idea that Putin couldn't even take Kiev, the idea that he's going to start marching to Berlin if there's some kind of negotiated peace here is just, it's not a rational way to look at it. It's simply
that's the interesting thing. I think for the political left, because of the associations with Trump and the first Trump impeachment, Ukraine became, a righteous cause and Russia the bad guy. I think for a lot of people, sort of mainstream Republicans, it's kind of Cold War nostalgia. They're acting like it's 1987 and the forces of the Warsaw Pact are ready to overrun Western Europe, unless the United States is willing to throw a couple of armored divisions in front of them. When obviously that's not the case, but which doesn't mean that Ukraine should be just abandoned, but it also, it's odd how Ukraine became the good cause, and the only reason why Israel is getting the money, is why Biden was willing to give so much to Israel is because he thought that would be the way to sell. Israel was getting $14 billion, and Ukraine was getting another $60 billion after getting, I think, close to $150 billion in the previous year.
Yeah. Sometimes I wonder if Israel would get it, if there were votes 10 years out, 5 years out. I wonder how these votes for Israel aid in general will go, not extra aid, just the normal aid. I wonder among Democrats, because I think, maybe I'm jumping the gun here, but I think there's less and less sort of a connection between the Democratic Party, even with many Jewish voters who I think increasingly don't care about Israel as much. I wonder how long that lasts. But, it seems to me like Ukrainian funding will last forever as long as Zelensky wants to fight the war. And I'm not blaming Zelensky. I understand his position, but, I just think the people who live there, this is a complicated situation there. The Russian people who live on the eastern provinces have as much right to say, we want a state as Palestinians do, but it would never be seen that way because, Russia's evil and the Palestinians are supposedly oppressed people.
Yeah, well, I think that's true. I think it's worth just throwing out there that there is a major difference between aid to Ukraine and aid to Israel. Aid to Israel, almost all of it is spent in the United States. It's all fully accounted for. Whereas, the aid to Ukraine, nobody seems to know exactly where it's going or, exactly how much it's paying for. We've gotten assurances from the Biden administration, but, there's been no real accounting for these much larger sums. I mean, I think you and I, we've been, writing, those of us who have been writing about these sorts of issues for, the last couple of decades, the aid to Israel has, the 3.8 that they get in military aid, which, as I said, is spent in the United States mostly, is thrown in the faces of the pro-Israel crowd as, why does Israel get so much taxpayer money? Whereas, the Ukrainians are getting, 10, 20, 15 times as much, and nobody, it's all of a sudden, that's fine. Nobody's questioning that.
I've worried about that aid for years now. I worried about it during the Obama administration in the sense that when you take a lot of money from someone, and it's quite a bit, even if it's spent here, you owe those people something. And I think that the United States and Israel has had a great relationship. But what happens when they don't? And you have people pressuring you or trying to pressure you into doing things that are detrimental to your own country and your own democracy and your own people. And I think that any kind of two-state solution, which seems to be the obsession again of DC, is if not suicidal for Israel, as close to it. So I do worry about that, and that Israel being too reliant on the United States. But it is a small country, obviously, and they do need help. So I don't know, maybe I'm being too much of a doomer on this relationship. I hope that I'm wrong. But when you look at young voters, when you look at what's going on in the Democratic Party, the trend is not headed in a very good direction.
Yeah, well, let's focus in on that for a moment. We hear an awful lot, I mean, those of us who have been following it and covering it, about Biden's problems in Michigan, specifically Dearborn, which is a majority Arab American, and Dearborn, Michigan. And the Biden administration has gone all out. I mean, they're spending a lot of effort trying to persuade Arab American voters to stick with Biden because they were perceived as being part of the coalition that turned that state for Biden in 2020. And they're saying because of Biden's, even though certainly from the point of view of supporters of Israel, Biden has kind of been talking out of both sides of his mouth about Israel throughout the war, it's still too much pro-Israel for them. And, we had things like the administration sending the deputy national security director to sort of bend the knee to the mayor of Dearborn, who is basically pro-Hamas, Abdullah Hamid, and who wouldn't take a meeting with Biden's campaign manager. And now next they sent Kamala Harris, which I don't know how much of a vote of confidence that would be for Michigan Democrats. Although, as the New York Times stated, she is perceived as being less supportive of Israel than Biden. So they thought that's a good idea. It's an interesting, for me, it's interesting because Biden claims that he entered the 2020 race because he was so offended by what happened in Charlottesville, Virginia in August 2017. That was his, rhetorical point, claiming that Trump said the Nazis were good people too, that he didn't actually say that, but that became the abiding myth. And now he's seeking to hold on to the office basically by appeasing the anti-Semites in Michigan, even while ignoring the possibility. I mean, you said before about, yes, Jews vote overwhelmingly for Democrats, but, I wrote last week in JNS about a poll of New York, voters, which showed that Jews were actually for Trump. Now, Democrats are saying, oh, that can't be true, but it did show some movement. And so maybe he's worried about losing the wrong voters.
Yeah, I mean, think about it this way. He can afford to lose some Jewish voters in New York or California or even Florida, where he's probably where he would lose. But he can't really afford to lose Michigan. And so Michigan is an important state for him. So you understand that. But I also just think in general, younger Jews care less. Older Jews still care about Israel. And there's a growing Arab population that seems more political than they were before. Now, you said they were pro-Hamas, and I think that is something we shouldn't forget. Anyone who wants a ceasefire before Hamas is destroyed is pro-Hamas. You could frame it any way you want. There was a big, I forgot it was a demonstration or kind of like a get-together in Dearborn where people were cheering before Israel had even retaliated. So that's worth remembering that I think that a lot of people, and there's polling that shows this, believe Hamas was justified in doing it because they think, that Palestinians deserve a state and that they were occupied, which you and I know is not true in Gaza. So that's worth remembering. But yeah, I mean, I think it shows no principles to do what he did, sending people there and so on. But it's a reality that Michigan's much more important for them right now than some Jewish votes that are lost in New York and California or places like that. And I will also say that, and I'm sure you're with me or you've gone through the same things. I've been around a bit and I've heard that the Jewish vote is moving towards Democrats. One time too many to actually believe it until I see it. I think the last time they've really done well, Republicans have done well with the Jewish vote is probably Ronald Reagan, right? First election.
But just the first time, not the second time. No, you're absolutely right. That has been the fool's gold that Jewish Republicans have been chasing for, more than 40 years. I would just argue that as much as I remain skeptical and as much as there is reason to, you could even take a deep dive into that poll, the question is, number one, who are we talking about when we're talking about the Jewish vote, which is, as you said, younger people are less likely to be for Israel, older people more likely to be for it. But I think the divide is also in terms of religion. People who are more likely to be more religious, more conservative, are more likely to be pro-Israel, and sort of which way the demographic trends are going within the Jewish community, where, a large, the largest growing demographic slice of American Jewry is what they call Jews of no religion. At least, that's what Pew calls them. And they're not people who care very much about any Jewish issues. So why should they care about Israel? But I think one thing that might be a game changer, maybe not to the extent that Jewish Republicans are dreaming about, but is the surge in anti-Semitism in the United States. I've spoken to many liberal Jews, people who, diehard Democratic voters, would rather commit suicide than vote for Trump, but they were deeply troubled by what happened in this country after October 7th, especially on college campuses where they send their kids. the open anti-Semitism, the toleration of anti-Semitism. And that scared a lot of people, maybe not the most ideological, but I think it scared a lot of sort of mushy liberal Jews who assumed that anti-Semitism was only something that existed on the right. And now they're beginning to feel what some of us have been writing about, is that the sort of intersectional activist base of the Democratic Party, which had signed into critical race theory and all the woke ideology, the woke catechism of diversity, equity, and inclusion, that this really was a permission slip for anti-Semitism, as some of us have been warning. I'm not sure that will be enough to make them vote for Donald Trump, but it is causing many of them to pause and wonder what's going on.
You said a lot of interesting things there. First, I would say that, you have to think about, let's say, our experience with Israel and the experience of a young person. When I was young, Israel's this scrappy small nation fighting off, all these Arab nations and doing, and always on the brink, there's always an existential threat to its existence and so on. But that's not how a young person see it. They see, the Palestinians being oppressed. They see Israel as the more powerful nation, as the colonizer, and all that woke stuff into it and so on. So their experience is different. I wonder if these kind of terrorist acts this terrorist act might change that view. But you're definitely right about the anti-Semitism. I've had the same experience with some people on the left who are, pretty shocked by it, though they shouldn't be, because this has been, especially in colleges, but in the whole progressive activist movement, think about it, the Women's March, there were all these anti-Semites who were part of that. The Black Lives Matter had these kind of anti-Semitic trends going as well. It is part of progressivism. I mean, let's be honest, a lot of the anti-Zionism talking points, rhetoric, ideas go back to, Soviet Union era times. We're seeing almost the same language and ideas right now about it. I've seen some people blame what Israel's doing, blame Israel for the anti-Semitism, meaning, a progressive Jew will say, just because Israel is doing this doesn't mean it's, what Jewish people believe here and so on. But yet, on the other hand, most of these people don't make any distinction between Jews and Zionists and Israel and so on. For them, it's all, interconnected. And I think they're actually right about that in some way. It is interconnected. But I think that could change some minds. But I also think that memories are pretty short, and we'll see is I guess what I would say. I'm not sure. Like you say, it's also, Donald Trump's running, and Donald Trump, if it was someone, let's just say it was Ron DeSantis running, I think that he would have a better chance maybe of pulling over some of those people. But I do, I'm from New York. I grew up on Long Island, and I still have family there and stuff. I mean, there is an appeal of Donald Trump style, bigger government, conservatism, and populism that appeals to people in the Northeast as well. I just don't think it matters enough to flip an election. So it's complicated. I don't really know. I've thought that to me, the idea of a Jewish person voting for someone like Joe Biden right now after the way he's treated Israel is incomprehensible. So I can't get into the mind of a person who votes for him right now. And I'm not a one-issue voter or anything like that. But to treat Israel the way it does, and then to juxtapose what he's doing in Ukraine it just shows you what he thinks of that country, in my opinion. So.
Yeah. Well, let's talk. Let's take a dive into one part of the administration's policy that I think sort of explains a lot of it, and also the difference between how a Republican administration views these things. The Democrats really believe in multilateral institutions. They believe in the UN agencies, and that's become a real. That's not. That's an ideological battle between Republicans and Democrats. But when it comes to Israel, that has real meaning, because the UN is just a cesspool of anti-Semitism. Its agencies like UNRWA are basically devoted, to perpetuating the war against Israel and not settling it, and not resettling. Not solving Palestinian refugees, but keeping them alive, in place as props in the war against Israel. And this plays, an important role. And And that's sort of the double game that Biden is currently playing in the UN, where he vetoes, a UN Security Council resolution that would immediately cause a ceasefire and give a victory to Hamas. But then he proposes an alternative that would more or less do the same thing a little later.
They act as if the only way to fund the Palestinians in Gaza is through the UN, which just can't be true. I just know that we have the technology and the know-how to get them aid in different ways. But the problem is, like as you alluded to, is that the UN not only wants to perpetuate this war, they literally have employees participating in it. And It's not even a war. They're killing civilians, raping, and kidnapping. How can would the United States ever give money to an institution that did that to their citizens? But they did, actually. 30 Americans died, right? The least, I think. And the first thing Biden did was continued to fund Gaza, which is essentially funding Hamas. There has to be a way to govern that place without having Hamas in charge. I don't know what that is exactly, but I don't think that the Biden administration or Americans in general are interested in trying to help them figure it out. They just want to give them a state, which, as you know, will create a situation where you are going to have the Islamic Jihad or whatever they're called next, governing this place, and Israel will now have to invade another country, not just the territory that's there. And that, that's a different ballgame. So I don't know. The UN is clearly, one of the most anti-Semitic organization functionally, but also just outwardly that exists in the world probably right now. And I don't even understand how Israel can allow it to function in Gaza anymore after what happened, on October 7th. So I don't know. What's the or Qatar maybe is the other option. I don't think that's a good option either. So honestly, I don't know what they're going to do or how they're going to govern Gaza. I don't know that there's any good answer for that. But the UN certainly is not, the place for the United. Is not the way we should be. They should be doing it, or we should be doing it.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things for me is how the discussion about October 7th, Israel, Gaza, this current war, flipped so quickly from one of the worst terrorist outrages in history, and the large, as you noted, the largest mass killing of Jews since the Holocaust, and launched by a group that basically governed a state in all but name for 16 years in Gaza, and how that just on a dime switched to one about Israel committing genocide because it was trying to get rid of that group. It's kind of nuts on the one hand. I mean, it seems, I think, to many supporters of Israel, just anti-Semitism, but it does speak to the sea change in opinion where, we see things, in mainstream publications, or at least, the corporate media, like the New York Times and Washington Post, which treat these, lies about genocide and apartheid as just givens, treat the idea of whether there should be a Jewish state at all as something that reasonable people should be allowed to debate. I think, as much as we focus on what happens on college campuses and sort of these awful demonstrations in the streets with people, saying terrible things, that is in many ways much more sinister, the way that sort of these same sort of attitudes had been mainstreamed in public discourse in the United States.
I think that's right. I mean, I've argued many times that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. It doesn't mean, this ridiculous notion that you can't be critical of Israel. No one says that. Not really. Of course you can be critical of Israel. People in Israel are critical of Israel all the time. That place is nuts politically. They hate each other, right? Again, if you left them alone, I'm sure they would destroy that country from within. There'd be no doubt in my mind.
I think that was more or less what was happening last year before October 7th.
Right. But if you say, I know there are some, Sephardi Jews or whatever who don't, for theological reasons, don't believe in Zionism, and stuff like that. But if your contention is that Jews should not have a state after knowing what happened in the past 1,000 years, a place to go where they can be safe, then you're functionally and in any way really just anti-Semitic. Doesn't mean you're a country club anti-Semite who doesn't want a Jew and you're, to golf next to you, but it does mean that you don't believe that Jews should be safe. And the reason there was a sea change is because a lot of people don't like to see Jewish people with guns fighting back. They like, and a lot of Jews are this way, I'm sorry, they're more comfortable playing the victim all the time. And Israel rejects that kind of thinking, and that's prevalent in some quarters in the United States, where they have to act differently than other nations. And they shouldn't have to do that. I mean, right away when Israel started fighting back, that everything turned on that. And, there's people are yelling for ceasefire, even though Hamas doesn't accept Israel, even though Hamas attacked during a ceasefire, even though Hamas won't accept a ceasefire, they're calling on a ceasefire, which just means Israel should cease firing. And that's not a normal position that anyone would take. After 9/11, we didn't go around saying, maybe we should give the Taliban a state somewhere, so they'll be peaceful, or we should give Al Qaeda some kind of state, so they'll calm down. It's just have they read the Hamas charter? Have they looked at the polling that goes on in Gaza? Do they know that if there was an election in the West Bank, that it would be Hamas ruling there as well? They pretend none of that's true, and they live in this fairy tale that if you give someone a state, all of a sudden they're going to be peaceful. I could use all these arguments, by the way, on the eastern borders of Ukraine. All the people should just get a state. It's fine if Russia, will have a proxy state there and put missiles right next to Ukrainian cities. They would never accept that argument. But for some reason, Israel has to live by separate standards. Like someone gifted them something, a country, and now they just have to live by a different set of rules. No one ever talks about the right of Germans to have a state, or the right of Belgians to have a state, or Switzerland, which is a multicultural place. They are allowed to have a state. Everyone has a state. No one has to answer for it, except for one country in the entire world. And on the flip side, there are thousands or hundreds maybe of ethnic minorities, many of them much larger than Palestinians, who don't have a state, and they don't blow up things. And no one says, let's carve out part of Turkey and give it to the Kurds, or let's carve out part of Spain and give it to Basques. It's like it never occurs to people to say those things. It's just in this one place.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. I think Joe Biden was just tweeting, on posting on X, or whoever posts for Joe Biden on X. We know that Joe Biden, unlike Trump, is not sitting there typing away himself. That, Hamas has nothing to do with the Palestinians. The Palestinians should be treated separately from Hamas, even though they have broad, support. This is sort of, it's sort of an ideology. It's, like a lot of policies, it becomes sort of religion for those people who have believed in it for a long time. And the belief in a Palestinian state is, for a certain class of, not just the chattering classes, but for, sort of the whole, gang of Obama alumni who run foreign policy now. It's received wisdom, and they can't get past it. And it's their, even though for the first couple of years of this administration, they were quiet about it because they knew it was a non-starter, it was their immediate go-to, like, okay, there's a problem. Yes, we'll bring this up again. That will fix it. Even though the Palestinians have shown over and over again that they don't want a Palestinian state if it means living in peace with a Jewish state next door. But that never seems to matter.
Yeah, I mean, Trump was probably the first administration that tried to deal with the region without going through the Palestinian issue first. Though I think they first did approach them and they were rejected, so then they went around that. And it worked out pretty well. The idea that the Saudi Arabian government really cares about the Palestinian people is, of course, a joke, right? So I don't think they want to state the Hamas state there, Hamastan next door either, frankly. But Israel also, just to be clear, what they're asking of Israel is to create an independent state, which is proxy of Iran, but a 3-border proxy around their country. Hezbollah is in the north. Then you're going to, I don't know, a lot of people haven't been to Israel, but if you give a state to the PA in the West Bank, that is right on top of your cities, right on top of your population centers. What guarantee does anyone have that Hamas won't win an election there if they have one, or come to a violent coup? Then what happens? So anyway, it's just a ridiculous ask. And yet it is so, like you say, so I mean, they tried to make it happen. Palestinians rejected it. They want to restart history every time things fail. And that's just not how the world works. And I think constantly promising or keeping the promise of a state out there is actually hurting them. It's almost like they can't get on with their lives. They're so obsessed with this idea. I don't think it's going to happen for them, at least not for a very long time. They can't even deal with being given some autonomy as they were in Gaza. The first thing they did was demonstrate, the opposition and become a radical state and
right, and spend billions in foreign aid building more or less the equivalent of the New York subway system underneath Gaza.
Right, yeah. I don't know how any rational person can believe that they can be given a state right now and govern it in any kind of manner that isn't dangerous for the citizens of Israel. Why Israel would participate in that, I have no idea.
Yeah, well, I just came back, last week from spending some time in Israel, and I can tell you, even left-wingers, who certainly still hate Netanyahu, and, if you attend the annual, the weekly rallies in Hostage Square, which have, focused mostly not on Hamas, but on Netanyahu, and, the speeches tend to speak of the hostages as if Netanyahu took them and he's hiding them in his basement. But I didn't really meet anybody in Israel that is willing, that thinks that a Palestinian state now is viable, including people who might have been for it, in the past, just because they know it's impossible. And, you speak of the problems, with Lebanon. One of the things that is never reported in the American press is the fact that there are really hundreds of thousands of what we could only call displaced people or refugees, Jewish refugees inside Israel, people who have been forced to leave their homes in southern Israel and also in northern Israel. Until this war is over, until it's safe again. I mean, it's a weird time in Israel because, the hotels, there are no tourists, but the hotels are full, but they're not full with tourists. They're full with people who have nowhere else to go. And, being paid for by, their stays are being paid for by the government, and, who's going to pay for that? There's a complete disconnect from the reality on the ground there and what is, said in the White House and what is said on the editorial pages of, the New York Times and the Washington Post. There's just no connection between the two of them.
So how instead of saying, boy, we really hate gun owners, it's always the NRA. We hate the NRA. The NRA is this. They do the same thing with Netanyahu. Netanyahu is always the focus of their anger. Like Netanyahu is out of step, that he's a crazy hawk, that he's a big right-winger, that he's an authoritarian. You saw those leaks from the White House. Biden's calling him all kinds of terrible names. But the truth of the matter is there is no one, at least, I wouldn't call myself like a great expert on Israeli politics, but it seems to me at least that there's no party or no major party or no real force in Israel that would conduct themselves any differently right now than what Netanyahu is doing. And there's just, the same thing with Iran. Like there is no real party in Israel that would ever allow or want Iran to have a nuclear weapon. It was for the Iran deal. They keep blaming Netanyahu, who's an elected leader. They're so in love with democracy and all of this, but that elected leader for them is no good. Who they can aim all their ire at, not to say we don't like Israel. We don't like what Israel's doing. We don't like how it's protecting itself or whatever. And they blame that one man the way they blame Orban or the way they blame, whoever they don't like. But the truth is that Netanyahu, I think, first of all, he is not an authoritarian. I mean, I try to explain to people, I think he liberalized Israel in ways, and especially in the 90s, he helped in ways that, made Israel a far freer and better place for most of its citizens. I'm not saying he's perfect at all, trust me. But the idea that he's some kind of crazed dictator who is a bit, undermining, a Palestinian state or undermining the U.S. Relationship with Israel is, I think, wrongheaded.
Yeah, well, that's a good segue to talk a little bit about the future of democracy in this country. We're facing a choice between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, which Democrats tell us is about the future of democracy. At the same time, they're doing a lot of things that, would in any other country be considered anti-democratic, basically, trying to confiscate his property, jail him on, flimsy charges. This is, we started off talking about, anti-Semitism. And I think one of the great truths about American Jewish life is that the reason why American Jews prospered in the United States was American exceptionalism. This was a very different kind of country with a different sort of ethos than Europe and any place else. I do worry about American democracy, but not necessarily for the same reasons that a lot of the people talking about democracy seem to be worrying about it.
I'm worried about it also for different reasons. I think there's an arms race basically in corrupt. So what happens is, in my view, at least, is the Democrats don't really care about the process or Constitution very much. It's just how I feel. So Joe Biden will talk about democracy, but never explain exactly what that's exactly supposed to mean. And then he will say, we're going to forgive student loans, just a diktat, that the president doesn't have the power to do, but he does because it's the right thing. And Republicans say, or a lot of conservatives, especially, Trump fans say, why we can't just sit around and let them abuse power all the time and not do it ourselves and try to win power, because in the end, the system itself is not enough. I'm a big fan of process. Like, to me, preserving the process is the point, right? But for most people, don't view government that way. They want results and they want, to preserve, things and
they want free stuff for them.
Yeah, that's true too. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, the idea that people take the leading opposition candidate off a ballot in a state, there's nothing democratic about that. The unilateral, excessive executive abuses of Biden, following somewhat by Trump, but far less than Obama, is problematic. So while Trump says a lot of things that I don't like about governance, they do a lot of things I don't like and wrap it in a patina of legitimacy and this rhetoric about democracy. But they never say the Constitution. They always say democracy, because democracy is completely malleable to them. It can mean anything that they're doing right now. So I worry very much that people who want to destroy the Supreme Court, who smear justices just to try to get their way and intimidate them, those people are not pro-democracy in my book, and I'm very concerned about that. I don't think progressivism, and I think that the Democratic Party has gone far left, and the Constitution are compatible institutions, So I worry very much where that's all going. Sometimes there's a reaction and Americans wake up and want to do things differently. I'm not really a fan of Donald Trump, but if I had to choose between those two, what Donald Trump did during his term, putting people, for instance, on the Supreme Court who care about what the Constitution actually says, to me, that's less scary than what the Joe Bidens of the world, have planned. And he's supposed to be the moderate. Can you imagine when we get a Kamala Harris or someone else? So I worry about the future quite a bit for like you say, for different reasons than Democrats give. Though I do worry that there would be an arms race in this sort of thing, because people are sick of just being, losing. And if they feel like an election's stolen again, I wonder what's going to happen, even though Democrats will not accept election loss either. They haven't done that in many, many years.
Well, that to me is like the critical question right now. I think we know that Donald Trump will never accept it if he loses, whether he loses fair and square or not. But how are Democrats, say the polls right now, which are showing that Trump is winning and, he's even or ahead in the popular, in the overall head-to-head matchups, and even in where you throw in third-party candidates. He seems to be ahead in most of the battleground states. How are Democrats going to react if that actually holds true, and, if they don't jail him and they can't throw him off the ballot and Trump actually wins?
They're not going to accept the election. They didn't accept the 2000 election. They didn't accept Donald Trump winning. Many of them didn't accept the 2004 election. People forget that as well. I mean, there were, whatever. I don't want to get too deeply into that, but they do not accept losses. And I think that gets worse and worse. You already see that. I saw the other day Nancy Pelosi saying that, Donald Trump is, Putin has something over Trump. It's probably financial, like we've already debunked all this. We've already gone through this. I wrote a piece on this. I wish they would just have the decency to come up with a new conspiracy theory, because the Russian thing is so boring already. But they're not. I think we'll just go through the same stuff. They'll say the election's stolen. And it's going to be ugly either way, I think. People just can't accept that they lose elections anymore. And part of it is the kind of liberalization of election laws, the mail-in ballots, all this stuff kind of lends itself to, some cheating maybe, but it lends itself to people believing that things are too loose and that elections are unfair. And maybe they have a point. I'm not saying elections were stolen. I'm not saying Biden stole the election, but I wish that we had a better, I don't want to say I don't want to say that I wish it was uniform in the country, because then they're going to nationalize elections, which I'm completely against. But I do wish that there was more uniform thinking about what makes a good election, and that we could come to some sort of national consensus, so we stop thinking all the elections are stolen. Okay.
Well, David, I can't let you go without asking you about what your next book is going to be. I know you've spoken on your podcast about writing. What's your next book on? When can we expect it?
Later this year, probably, I think November or September, I'm unsure. And funny that you ask, it's about what we were just talking about. It's about how the left has become basically a party of conspiracy theorists, and how it's more dangerous because their style of conspiracy theory has been mainstreamed. It's glossy. It's spread by people on television that we're supposed to trust. It's not Alex Jones, it's the CNN, it's a CNN host who's doing it, and is much more sophisticated and much more ingrained in the operations of the Democratic Party, and pretty dangerous. So that's what it's about.
Okay. Well, we'll look forward to it. We'll look forward to having you back to discuss it after it comes out. David, I want to thank you for taking the time to join us today. And for those who want to follow David's work, you should go to the Federalist, read his columns there. Follow him at David Harsanyi. And we also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Top Story Daily Edition. And whether you're listening to us on Apple, Google Play, Spotify, or any of the other podcast platforms, or watching us live on Facebook or Twitter, or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to Top Story, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading, thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.